The croissant. The croissant. Nobody replied me. That's Yoruba. Means good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the class, African Thinkers. Right now, today I'm going to give you an overview of the course and then talk about Africa and define some keywords that will help us to better understand Africa in context of the global community. Next week, I will begin to talk about the history and historiography of philosophy or thinkers in Africa. In that context, I will also talk about few well-known Western philosophers. The following week, we begin a study what I call case studies. Because there are so many of them, I decided to select what I call the most influential African thinkers that have impacted Africa and the rest of the world. So we begin that case study in the third week. The fourth week, we also do a case study of another part of Africa, what we call the diaspora. These are peoples of African descent in the rest of the world, not only US, Russia, China, UK, everywhere else. Some of you, I'm sure you have the course outline, which also gives you a very short list of references, bibliography, to encourage you to do some reading on your own. I will not be able to teach you all that you need to know about African thinkers in this course. You will have to find a way to do that after this course, even during this course. To begin with, let me ask, how many of you here or in the Zoom have been to Africa? Wonderful. So you can help me then. That's great. That's very delightful. So I'm going to begin. Let me see. These technologies is working. I have some few terms I've listed. I've added some since I sent this in to Juliet. And I'm also borrowing from some of the work we have done, the Alajua County African Historical Society with the school district in teaching of Africa and the African American experience. It is important to understand some key terms. So we don't have to come back and wrestle with what do you mean by that or what do you mean by that. So let's begin with Africa. What is Africa? The ancient name for Africa is Al-Kabanu. Al-Kabanu, for ancient times, was the name given to Africa. Biblical literature will suggest Al-Kabanu in Hebrew means the home of mankind. In Arabic, however, it means something else, the land of black folks. You are going to find this kind of double, the duality understanding of Africa. 17th century, the name Africa came in, which was actually promoted by the Romans. So you see Africa is beginning to touch different parts of the world already, what we call Africa. It's really a product of modern history. Well, Al-Kabanu is an ancient name, the oldest we know. We don't call it that anymore. There is also another part of the history. Historians haven't quite proved that. A great historian, geographer, Leo Africanus. Some historians argue Africa was named after Leo Africanus, a great Arab scholar. So, for now, we are talking about Africa. Another important term that we need to understand, what is philosophy? Why do I call it Africa thinkers? This course has a history that came out of Ghana. I was a Fulbright scholar in Ghana. Then I became Kwame Nkrumah Endowed Chair at the Institute for African Studies. A part of my job was to help them develop their advanced studies courses. This was on a PhD level. I attended when I was there a lot of seminars to develop a baseline data. I didn't want to go there and just propose courses and programs without knowing what was already there. I attended a lot of dissertation defenses. And I heard so much about European philosophy. Remember, Ghana was a British colony. A lot of the scholars went to UK. Nkrumah was one of the few that came to the US. And so naturally, all they learned was what British people gave to them to learn. I went to school in what is now called Nigeria before it became Nigeria. I had no idea what Nigerian history was or what African history was until I came to this country in 1960. In fact, right here in Daytona Beach, I still didn't know too much about Africa until I went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. for my master's degree. And so the kind of colonial education we had nothing to do with Africa. We knew more about the British Empire than anything in Africa. I knew more about US history, the colonization of the 13 colonies and so on and so forth, than anything about Nigeria. And so that legacy remains very much so today as we speak in Africa, even African universities. And so my challenge was to do something a little bit different. I said, let's have a course on African philosophy. Let's have a course on African thinkers. Because there is a difference, I'll show you. Sometimes they think there's a difference. All thinkers are not philosophers. And all philosophers are not thinkers. You can be a philosopher by having a degree in philosophy. It doesn't make you a great thinker. And so I decided to develop this course. I call it African Thinker. I gave them a long list in African history from ancient times to the time I was there. I think I left there 2016. I don't know the fate of that course now. I don't know who's teaching it, but I left in the hands of the historians who were there. So when I became a member of the Humanities Committee, I said, well, let me take a look at this and see whether we can offer a course in African thinkers in an attempt to make sure that our curriculum has more international dimension. That was the whole story. I wasn't that naive, too naive to think that I can teach African thinkers course in 4 weeks. It's not going to happen, folks. But I can introduce you to it, and then you can take on from there. Maybe another semester, another year, we can do a more in-depth analysis of the people. As we go ahead, we will see what we can do with the case studies. You might select some key people you want to study and look at their impact in world history or in African history. So that's a matter of background. So what is philosophy? Or who are philosophers? Who are thinkers? In general, this group of people, they are concerned with 3 things. One, to have a better knowledge of the universe in which we live in. And two, to create more knowledge for a better understanding, they were called mankind. I call it humankind. And three, to do some work about human beings and their relationships with their gods, small letter G. And you find out later on that a lot of philosophers and thinkers, they're always connected with the universe, with human beings, and with their gods. That's what their preoccupation from the very, very beginning. Even the ancient Greeks that went to study philosophy in Egypt, Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, they all were trying to find out what we know about the universe. What do we know about humankind? I'm still trying to find out myself, humankind behavior. So that's about philosophy. Now, African philosophy, these are thinkers about the continent of Africa. I'm talking about continental Africa. There are two types of Africa, continental Africa and then Africa in the diaspora. Africa in the diaspora simply means Africans outside Africa, Africans in Europe, Africans in US, Africans in Russia. In fact, we have enough scientific evidence now that it's very possible there were Africans in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade. We do know about Africans in China. They are very early dynasties. They were all running around trading and so on and so forth. So that's about the diaspora part. We are going to cover that in the case study. I've selected some key philosophers or thinkers in the diaspora. It was a very difficult task. Who are those people in the diaspora who have influenced people more than anybody else? It's a difficult selection. A lot of them are great scholars, Du Bois and so on and so forth. So we talk about that. That's about African philosophy and the diaspora in terms of definition. Now, the Africana, you hear that term from different places, Africana philosophy. Africana philosophy is a term coined by scholars in the diaspora as well as Africa. It's a combination of African philosophers and philosophers in diaspora. And there are philosophers who are thinkers who look at Africa as a continent, at the same time, the extension of Africa. They say we are African people, but we are in the diaspora. And they're also conditions by the environment in the diaspora. So it's also Africa. Okay. I have periodization is something I'm going to talk about more when we meet next week. This is kind of game historians play. We divide history into different periods of time. I have my own quarrel with that. They begin by saying we have what we call prehistory. My own historiography has led me to believe there's no such thing as prehistory. Every history in human experience, they are verbalized first or observed. They are never written down. The whole history of writing is a very short history within the span of human being. So if you define history as something that's only written, then we are going to lose more than 3/4 of human experience. And so for me, there's no such thing as prehistory. Oral history, that was when Western historiographers denied that oral history was history. They taught us that Africa did not have a written history, and therefore oral history was not history. Well, you and I know better now that oral history have become one of the biggest areas now for the study of history. So that's what happened in disciplines. We made some progression. And so from prehistory, then we start talking about ancient history. There are dates, I'm not going to bore you with all those dates, associated with these periods. So you have ancient history, then you have modern history, and then you have what we call what? Medieval history. Of course, medieval history comes before modern history. Either call it medieval or we call it what? Middle Ages. That's one period of history. Then modern history. Now we are talking about contemporary history. There was a time we never regarded anything contemporary as history because we always have to study something that's already dead before we call it history. But there is such a thing now as contemporary history. So those are the four areas in which we look at history in order to understand what's going on. But I have also added some other terms that I want to share with you after I send this to Juliet. You may hear this term very often, at least probably read about it when you read after independence. It's called Africanization. What is Africanization? It was a reaction by Africans who wanted to go back to their African history, African lifestyle. They wanted to Africanize the civil service, which was created by the British. All of that was created by the British, what they understand from the British Constitution. And so after independence, you hear some talk about Africanization. Kwame Nkrumah was one of the first people to try to Africanize the Ghanaian civil service. Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah. I don't know how, well, this new technology, most of my teaching, I write these things on the board so you can understand the spelling and everything else. So if you don't get the pronunciation of the spelling, just raise up your hand. I will say Kwame Nkrumah. He was the first president of what is now called Ghana. It used to be called the Gold Coast. That's another colonial history. So Africanization is a term that are being used. With Africanization is also the notion of another word, decolonization. I'm sure you hear this all the time, decolonization. In fact, it's been applied now even into the American setting. Somebody say, we want to decolonize the American public school curriculum. Okay. Okay. Decolonization, what does it mean? It means becoming Afrocentric as opposed to Eurocentrism. In other words, don't be a European, be an African. The question is, what is it to be an African? Some of that we find out from the thinkers. What is it to be an African? You're an African because you're Black, or you're an African because you were born in Africa. That's something we'll grapple with that as we move on. So the notion of decolonization is very, very important. And also the notion of being Afrocentric. Those are the terms you're going to be hearing. You also hear the term, and this is very popular, Nkrumah, many other African leaders talked about this even before the independence. The word is called neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism. Neo means new. And we see the signs of neo-colonialism all over Africa as we speak. They are not there anymore. The European colonizers are not there anymore. But they control all the resources and even the culture of Africa. It's like saying economics are invisible hands that is controlling the economy. It can come in the nature of China. It can come in the nature of American benevolence or French, where a lot of the Francophone countries are still paying taxes to France. The exploration. of the natural resources of the continent. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But that's just the word definition. Lastly, OAU. OAU, Organization of African Unity. They have changed it now to AU, African Union. You will hear these terms everywhere or in the television, African Union. The OAU was organized, it was between Kwame and Haile Selassie. I was one of the products of that whole movement. In 1958, just after independence of the Gold Coast in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah convened the first All-African People's Conference in Accra, the capital of Ghana now. Haile Selassie was invited from Ethiopia. At that time, there were probably only two countries in whole of the continent that were free. Ethiopia, of course, was one of them. The second one, arguably, was Liberia, our own American colony. And so the rest of the countries were moving towards independence. Nkrumah had met a number of people of African descent in the movement towards independence in Africa. That's another word. It's called Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism movement, which was not started by people in Africa, it was started by peoples of African descent in the New World. The first conference of that movement was convened in London in 1900, organized by H. Sylvester Williams, who was at that time the British called him barrister at law, was a lawyer, who had experienced racism in UK. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first Black American to receive a PhD from Harvard in history, was invited. At that time, he was working with the Niagara movement, organizing Black folks here to do they have their own problem, and then the establishment of the NAACP, 1910. So they had that first conference, and there were several other conferences. 1919, the First World War was just getting over. 1921, 1927, and the very last one in UK was in 1945 in Manchester, England. Kwame Nkrumah was at that conference, leaving the United States where he came to study to attend the conference. So for the first time, the movement towards African independence, Kwame Nkrumah took it from there in 1945 into Ghana in 1958. It's called the Accra Conference. And the whole idea was, according to early literature by Du Bois, was the creation of USA. Not the United States of America, but United States of Africa, ultimately, by helping the African countries to become free, independent, and then come together. So OAU was a product of that conference in 1958, where Haile Selassie announced scholarship to young Africans who would like to come and study in Addis Ababa. He said, he declared, Ethiopia is a part of Africa, and we want them to come and study. Well, I was one of the first Haile Selassie scholars in Addis. I met somebody who told me earlier that she was there the same time I was there when we never met, in 1959. Now, what brought me to US, the part of my bio, was in 1960, I took a train from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, went through Alexandria in Egypt, went to Switzerland, for international internship with Swiss Air. It was there I had a letter from Bethune-Cookman, established by a black woman in 1904, that I had a full scholarship. I was in Zurich, having a good time, learning what they call Low German. It's very close to the borderline with Germany. But the letter of scholarship did not have any transportation, which meant I had to go back to Addis to finish I was studying economic history in Addis Ababa. And I say this to all young people who are engaged in internship, take it seriously. I was very serious. The manager came to my office one morning and said, Jacob, I understand you have scholarship to go to US. Are you still going? I said, yes, sir. How about your scholarship in Addis? I said, I'd rather go to US. But I know how to swim, but I can't swim through Atlantic Ocean to get to US. He said, you're a good intern. I want you to know that every day, USA flies to New York 3 times a day. Here's your ticket if you want to go back, if you want to go to US. That's how fate brought me to the United States in 1960. I never went back to Addis until 2016. My wife and I said, let's go back to Addis and see the dormitory I used to live. It was called Menelik Hall. Well, I say all of this to define OAU. Haile Selassie gave one of his palaces to the OAU, and that was the beginning of the Organization for African Unity. And it's now called AU. Both men who started it have died. I mean, Nkrumah, of course, was gone, and Haile Selassie is gone. So that's, by the way, another definition. Now I want to talk about what I call Africa at a glance. We have tried to define Africa. What is Africa? It is important to do this for a very simple reason. All African thinkers, they were products of the environment. And so you have to create a context to understand what they were writing and what they were talking about. That context is understanding Africa in a nutshell. It's not something that I can, that's the map of the continent there. Let me see what I can see here. Yeah, that's Africa. We'll look at it from modern onto that period. But let me go back to this map so you can see it there. Today, as we speak, 1960 was a magic day for African independence. Most of the African countries became independent in 1960. Today, we have about 54 countries in Africa that are independent. And that's a long story. When you start talking about independence, you also have to talk about what happened before independence, colonialism. We can only talk about modern colonialism that led into independence of these countries. Because there was also ancient colonialism. That beautiful part of the Mediterranean, the Moors from Spain, the Berbers, the Romans, Alexander the Great with Egypt, all those were what we call ancient colonialism. Somehow we don't talk about that. We only talk about modern colonialism. The African colonialism is very, very recent in human history. There has always been an element of colonialism, conquest. Conquest. Not only in the ancient world, but in the modern world. But having said that, let's focus on Africa as it is today. Africa, the continental Africa is divided into 5 regions. North Africa, some people may not like that, because there was thinking before that North Africa was not a part of Africa. Egypt was not a part of Africa. The entire north of Africa, one region. South Africa, the second region. East Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa. These are the 5 regions in Africa. The 6th region that UN has been talking about is the African diaspora, because they are in the millions outside Africa who still have connections, like I do, with that continent, or like most Americans with Europe, and Black Americans with Africa. Same thing with the Caribbean. Somehow, we like identity. Where do we come from? It's always a question mark. So, what can I tell you about Africa, the continent? It is the 2nd largest continent in the world. I remember when I was at KU, I used to have a big lecture, 200 students, and I asked them my first test. I make a statement, true or false. Africa is a very beautiful country. Is there anything wrong with that? How do you react to that? True or false? How many of you say true? Nobody said false? Oh, you say false? They would say, Professor Gordon, you are tricking us. I said, no, I'm not tricking you. I just want to know your geography. The bottom line is Africa has never been a country. It's a continent, the largest continent in the world. But a lot of my students then, they had a mindset. This is my pre-test for Intro to Africa. At the end of the semester, I asked them the same question. I'm lucky to have 50% pass it. Because they have this mindset from home, from everywhere. Africa is a beautiful country. Let me go look at the animals in Africa. Or look at people who are primitive, who have no shoes on their legs. It's fun to look at it. But it is what it is. 2nd largest continent in the world. It's about 12 million square miles. 12 million square miles in size. It currently has a population of 1.5 billion people. This cradle of civilization is also the youngest continent in the world. The median age is about 18.8 years old. 18.8 median age. Nigeria alone, the largest country in the continent, its youth population is more than 60%, about 64%. Very young, and yet old. It has the largest natural sources than anywhere in the world. It is the most diverse continent in the world. From religion to lifestyles, the food you eat, your music, you name it, very diverse. You can't just say you spend some time in Nigeria and that's the whole of Africa. Linguistically, very diverse. All kinds of languages, including ancient languages that are still around. A lot of them are dying away. Because the older folks are dying away. It also has the oldest system of writing Europeans thought that Africa had no writing system. Then after a little while, they said, oh, how about hieroglyphics in Egypt? They forgot a lot of writing systems developed even before Egypt. How about gaze? G-E-E-Z, with that little accent. Writing system is also a language. Gaze. Imbecile. These are writing systems. You can Google what I'm telling you and you find out. You say, wow. These people knew all of this? They did not only have writing system. They have something else that I've been very critical of all African studies programs in this world or in this continent, not even Africa. It's called semiology. Semiology is the study of signs. Sign. Like you are driving on the highway, you see signs. Nobody's studying it. It was a means of communication. Symbols. This thing I'm wearing, if the Ghanaian here will tell you what this design means. Look at Kenny Clark. They talk to you with signs. So were the earlier philosophers, thinkers. Not only in writing, but also in science. I'm going to show you some science when we get to that. Some symbols. That's the part of Africa that we are talking about. So the diversity is very, very great. And that's one of the arguments against the creation of the United States of Africa. That's one of the arguments against unity of Africa. They said it's so diverse that there's no way on earth you can put it together. They say, thank God Europeans gave us European languages. We have English, we have French, we have Portuguese. Oh, they used to have German after the war. They took all their territories from them. But talking about Africa in terms of its diversity, it's not enough. I suggest that Africa has never been in isolation. There are people who think that Africa was isolated, little dark continent. Europeans call it dark continent. Oliver Page once wrote, what is dark about Africa is European ignorance. There was nothing dark about it. They were there. They created civilizations. They have kingdoms. They have empires. They created human institutions. And sociologists look at one or two or four of them. The family unit. After the Homo sapien, more than 253,000 years, the first human being to stand erect, like you and I, came out of that cradle. That's if you believe in scientific interpretation of human evolution. If you believe in creationism, that's another story. You got to go to the Bible to do that. And by the way, Al-Kalbana was called the Garden of Eden also by the Hebrews. And so we got to look outside there to see Africans' connections with the rest of the world. Even before Europeans got there, they knew what Africa was. We call that African connections. As I indicated earlier, when I talk about African diaspora, there were Africans in ancient China. I have a scholar in Shanghai who I write with all the time. He's published a lot of work in this field. They have African studies in China, you won't believe it. And yet we think Africa was isolation. The question I keep asking myself, why is it that Africans traded with everywhere in the world? They traveled everywhere. How come they didn't take all that land and colonize them? They had the opportunity. They never did. I don't know whether we ever find that answer. Is it because of their humanity? Or what is it? That's another story. How does Africa look like as we speak today in terms of its impact on global community, in the global world? It's stated that 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of the world premium come out of Africa. That's not surprising. What we call Ghana now used to be called the Gold Coast, named by the British. When they arrived there, they saw so many gold. My goodness, let's call it Gold Coast. The same thing with the Ivory Coast, called the Ivory Coast, because of these natural resources. 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa. Now, you can look at China as big as it is. Very big desert, that's what it is. It's not surprising then that Chinese are going to Africa, East Africa, and farm and send food home to China. It's not surprising then Chinese are in Ghana, digging gold illegally with some crazy native chiefs and being caught and imprisoned. Go to the Congo. Every natural resource will be found in the Congo. Congo has become a battleground for neo-colonialism. I can list a long thing about all the things that Africa actually has when you look at from population to youth to resources and the rest of them. The question people always ask, the question I ask, why is it that Africa has all these natural resources? Oldest and yet youngest continent in the world. Rich and at the same time poor. Rich in culture, in diversity, natural resources. And they use all of that to develop the global north. In fact, I have a book entitled Africa and the African Diaspora in the Development of the Global North. I just use two things. What developed the global north? National resources and what? Human capital. Those are the two factors in economics that develop the global north. All of them coming out of the continent. The human factor included the transatlantic slave trade that created the greatest plantation system the world has ever seen in the Americas. It was the engineer, was the main factor that led into the Industrial Revolution in Europe. There would have been none. Eric Williams wrote a book, his PhD dissertation in London, entitled Capitalism and Slavery. He said, slavery created capitalism. The cotton kingdom, the sugar plantation, even right here in our state. Levy. We are what we call Levy County, right? Where do you think Levy came from? So Mikonopi, with a big plantation, came from Morocco. Jewish, Moroccan. His son David became one of our first senators. If you read Florida history, you know how important David Levy Yulee. He went back to capture his grandfather's name, Yulee, but it's actually David Yulee. Levy Yulee. And there's Levy County right here in Florida. That's how connected Africa is. The first country to recognize American independence was in Africa, Morocco. So Africa, contrary to what a lot of historians say, has never been isolation. Has always been a part of the global community. You will see some of that in their thinking as you do these case studies, or as you go around yourself and look at some of the names I've suggested there. That's not all. Those are just my own selections. Some of the most influential thinkers in the continent. I'm going to have a Q&A before I finish. Somebody let me know what the time is. I got 10 minutes. Let me talk about some critical institutions created in Africa, because we always talk about African kingdoms and African empires. Especially in West Africa, you know, we talk about Kush, Mali, who was also one of the thinkers we are going to look into, King Mansa Musa. We all think that the British created indirect rule when they came to colonize Africa. This was the man. By every standard, everywhere I've read, he was probably the richest man ever lived on earth at his time in Mali. They have educational system, University of Timbuktu. When a lot at that time, a lot of all that so-called civilizations now had nothing to do with the universities. And a new university was discovered not too long ago in another kingdom in ancient Ghana. So ancient Ghana, Mali, Kush, Nubia, Zimbabwe, the list goes on. We can talk about all of that independently. There is a distinctiveness and universality in African history of these countries. Some of them are very distinctive, but there's also some element of universality that connects the rest of the world. So put together, I use a sociological analysis. What are the great institutions in human experience? One, the family. How did Africa create the family system? It's characterized as extended family system. Now, I always tell my students, I say, you can't just study only Africa. You got to see Africa in the context of other history. In fact, I have to argue, you don't really know enough about African history if you don't know European history. So we are forced, when I did my diplomatic history, to study other histories. How did Europe interact? What institutions did they have in Europe before they came to Africa? And what happened when things fell apart, when there's a collision, when Europeans telling Africans, what you have is no good. This is what we bring you. The Portuguese first came to Africa to trade. My great-great-grandfather traded with the Portuguese long before the slave trade. So they created an institution which is family, extended. If your cousin is 100, that's your family. It doesn't end my first cousin or second cousin. And you dare not touch once you know your cousin. I remember after many years, I went back to Nigeria. My brother killed goat to celebrate everything. He said, oh, this is your cousin, this is your cousin. I said, oh, okay. I've never known them all my life. But my mama was there to let you know they have that history. We are going to be talking too about these thinkers, how they communicate through proverbs, African proverbs. I'm just reminded of one of those proverbs in connection with the family. The family is the foundation. We know that in America. It's vanishing all over the world. Even the family in Africa, what it used to be, it's not like that anymore. It's over. With modern technology, with urbanization, things are shifting from extended family system into the old European family system. It's just me, my wife, my kids, and my dog. That's the shift. Okay. Or my cat. We spend money on dogs than we spend on human beings in the West. What other great institution did this people create? Take religion. Because a lot of thinkers and philosophers all over the world, they always think about religion. Africans never really thought about religion. They really had no religion. Guess what they had? Spirituality. Spirituality. Religion came later on. Muslims in 7th century. Christianity was there. A whole list of things like that. Spirituality. They have deities. They have priests. What kind of governor do they establish? The governor they establish is a part of our debate right now in America. Gerontocracy. Government by the elders. We are just talking about it now, but it happened thousands of years ago. Because they believe, well, Americans believe that too. That's why we have age requirement to become a president. You got to acquire some experience, at least 35. Probably should be 50 now. Economy. That's what led them to the development of agriculture. From just running around collecting food, it started settling down to do some planting. You hear a lot about agriculture in the north region of Africa, which is north of Nigeria, and also what actually happened in ancient Egypt. Farming, industrialized, irrigation system, that kind of technology. So they survived. Okay? What was their educational system? People say they have no education before Europeans got there. Europeans say, when we got there, we gave you education. But Africans had education thousands of years before they got there. They have the writing system for educating people. For them, as a parent, you are the first teacher of your child, discipline. Was built upon discipline and humanity, and the list goes on. Okay? So there are a lot of institutions they created. Communications, they have it. What about health? How did the ancient Africans take care of their health? It was not, if you study any good history about the origin of medicine, you will have to trace it back to the continent. Whether it is surgery or whether it is some plants out there. I knew that when my mother died, age of 103. So I knew a lot about what she knew in terms of medicine. You go out to the bush there, you got some roots. I never used toothpaste and toothbrush until I came to America. I used toothstick. I kept my gum. Doctors asked me, "Are these your teeth?" I said, "Yes, I'm 85. They are my teeth." I've never removed any. Now, I'm young, but I saw a little of that. Now, I want to leave you with what do I characterize, those of you who want to study more. What are the major historical movements in Africa? To sum it up, what are the major historical movements? It begins with Homo sapien, the genesis of the human race. It impacts the whole world. What do we understand? The idea of color came later on. Nobody talked about color. You were just a human being that was created. Color line came in European history, 17th, 18th century philosophers. Another great impact in historical movement in Africa that actually impacted Africa was the transatlantic slave trade as well as the trans-Saharan slave trade. A lot of my fellow scholars, they always talk about transatlantic slave trade, which is very recent in history. What about the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was done by the Arabs? Arabs took a lot of Africans slave trade, even to China in the very, very early dynasties. You will see that in Morocco and different other parts from West Africa. So slave trade was a very profitable market for the whole world. But the transatlantic slave trade is one of the most dehumanizing slave trade in all human history. Granted, there was slavery within Africa, there was slavery everywhere. But the transatlantic slave trade was the most dehumanizing slave trade ever. Now, if you go to Charleston, you will see the museum, they will tell you. Or go to Washington, D.C., you see the National African Museum, they will tell you that. I don't have to tell you. Or see what happens here. That's a great impact on Africa. What's the other great historical movement that impacted Africa? Colonialism. After the slave trade was colonialism. I got you there. Colonialism. Next, World War I, World War II. African soldiers fought in the war they never created. They were European wars. After they divided Africa in 1884 in Berlin Conference, they became a part of the European war. In my sense, they were very crazy. Have you ever seen a place where the French and the British were fighting wars, 100 years war? Until they got into 30 years war. The Wars of the Roses, 7 years war. And then boom, 1914. With the assassination of the Archduke, World War I, has a great impact. The other great historical movement right now is globalization. Has great impact in studying African history. That's where I'm going to stop. Are there any questions, or did I go over time?
Any questions? Oh,
Don't be shy. Ask questions, please.
let's get the microphone.
When you mention the size and area of Africa, Mozambique and other islands are included?
That's just the land area.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's just the land area. That's why they have a lot of arable land. I can't understand where Africa is not producing the largest food production in the whole world. They have the opportunity to do that. They got the land. That's another story. People say Africa is about 3 sizes of the United States.
I see. My other question is, you make mention of decolonization. Is it your belief that this decolonization is totally finished? That or does it still exist in a different shape and form?
Can you rephrase that question?
We spoke about the freedom of the
Yes.
African countries from their respective colonies.
Mhm.
Is it you believe that this freedom exists these days, or could we still talk about colonization in a different form and shape?
Gotcha. That's why we talked about neo-colonialism. It's a different form. The only difference is that Europeans are not there as governors or president, but their invisible hands are still controlling human behavior and all African resources. Let me give you an example. When we say decolonization, we don't mean rewriting just African history. We're also talking about decolonizing the African mind, which have been colonized by the Europeans. They learn to think like Europeans. They can't write a sentence without quoting Latin. It makes them feel good. When I first went to the University of Ghana, I was invited to come to Oxford Club. These were Ghanaians who studied Oxford University. I was never invited to come to the Ghana University Club. They are still thinking Oxford is the best university. They are not thinking about their own university. You see? So we have a challenge when we talk about decolonization. It's not only changing the literature or changing the narrative which colonialists have made about Africa, but also changing the African mind to become more Afrocentric, to have their own identity as Africans, not as quasi-Europeans. Because they can never be, even if they want to be. Okay?
Jacob,
No more questions?
Dr. Gordon, we appreciate this and we'll look forward to our second session next week with you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your presence. Okay. Because